Understanding Chinese involves more than just knowing words and phrases. It's about using context to interpret meaning. My recent trip to China highlighted the crucial role of top-down listening when navigating dialects, speech patterns, and unexpected questions. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to share with you some insights from my recent trip to China. Even if I use Chinese regularly in my daily life here in Sweden as well, it's quite different to be in an immersion environment, and there were many things that I observed that I think would be suitable for upcoming episodes and articles. So in this week's episode, I'm going to highlight something about listening comprehension that I thought was very interesting during my trip, and I have several examples to share with you. I don't know if it's my interest in listening comprehension that made me think about this so much during the trip, or because it really is something that stands out in general. What I want to discuss in this episode is the role of top-down listening and the fact that it is probably much more important than you think. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time in recent years researching listening comprehension, and even though I've done that and I know the importance of top-down listening, it still occurred to me several times in different contexts how important it is to be able to use what you already know. It's about interpreting information in context based on things you have observed and already understood, and if you fail to do these things, or if there is no context, listening comprehension becomes much harder. This is what top-down listening is all about. It's about using information you already have to make sense of what you hear. So this is in essence the opposite of what most people think of when we talk about listening comprehension. That would be bottom-up listening, and that is when you extract information from what you hear. That involves things such as hearing tones and sounds, being able to identify words, connect them with words you've stored in long-term memory, and so on. And it's a bottom-up process. We start with the smallest things, the sounds and tones, and we build up to understanding. And top-down listening, which is what I want to talk about in this episode, is then the opposite. You start with the highest level, the biggest unit, so to speak, i.e. meaning and understanding, and you use this to process and make sense of the Chinese you hear. Successful listening comprehension requires both of these to work, but most students tend to focus on bottom-up listening and tend to neglect the power of top-down listening. And yes, if you are a beginner, it's natural to focus on the sounds and tones because they stand out as being foreign and they kind of block understanding of everything else if you don't have the basics down. But once you reach an intermediate or advanced level, top-down listening becomes extremely important, and yet it's something that most teachers don't talk about at all. If you want to learn more about these things, you should check out my series Beyond Tingbudong, where I talk about listening comprehension in more detail. And I talk about bottom-up listening in episode 112 and top-down listening in episode 121. I am also working on a new course aimed at listening comprehension called The Fluent Listener, Navigating Mandarin Like a Fish in Water. And if you're interested in that, check out hackingchinese.com/courses and scroll down to the listening course. Please note that as I'm recording this in July 2024, the course is still under construction, but I hope to be able to launch it in the autumn of 2024. If you want to know more about the course, you can also leave your email address there and I will notify you when there is information about a release or early access. So let's get back to my insights about listening comprehension from my trip to China. I have 3 examples of top-down listening being very important that I want to share, and the first one is regarding dialects. As most of you probably know, China is linguistically very diverse, and even if we stick within Mandarin, there are many ways of speaking Mandarin. Some people speak it as their second language, and they speak another language at home, and that means that when they speak Mandarin, they have an accent. But even if Mandarin is their native language, there is a lot of variety, and people speak it quite differently. I've spent most of my listening with fairly standard pronunciation, either because the people I know just happen to speak like that, because they are teachers, or because I watch programs or listen to audiobooks and so on, where people have fairly standard accents. I've also spent 4 years in Taiwan, but as you probably know, the accent and the way people speak there is somewhat different from Beijing. This is something I always find somewhat tricky when visiting northern China, and especially when speaking with younger people who sometimes have a very relaxed way of speaking. They swallow even more syllables, and if you will, from my point of view, who's used to enunciating most syllables, they seem to mumble a bit and definitely don't enunciate very clearly. A similar issue can occur when speaking with older people who sometimes have more of an accent or they speak in a way that isn't standard, at least not anymore, and you may not have heard many people speak this way. And of course, if you've learned all your Chinese in Beijing, you will have less problems with this than I have. But of course, China is very big and there are many people in Beijing who are not actually from Beijing speaking in lots of different ways. And if you visit some other part of China, you will have the same problem still. So what's this got to do with top-down listening then? Well, as long as you have context and can roughly guess what people are saying, you don't need to understand everything that's being said. And even if you have learned the words and phrases that people use, they just say it in a way that makes it harder to understand, you will be able to understand the meaning and the gist anyway, provided that your top-down listening is very good. This requires three types of knowledge, namely pragmatic, discursive, and world knowledge. And I've discussed these in the episodes I mentioned earlier, but let's go through them briefly here. So pragmatic knowledge is about understanding words used in context. And discursive knowledge is about the structure of communication. So for example, how you can expect a certain type of conversation to play out, or what you're expected to say in specific situations. Finally, world knowledge is knowledge about the world we live in, facts about it, including culture. You need all three types of knowledge to understand accents in Mandarin, but I think discursive knowledge is probably the most important one. And that is about, like I said, knowing what someone might say in a situation. What are you expected to say when you receive a delivery from someone? What's the normal thing to say in a restaurant? What do you tell your neighbors when you meet them on the street? And things like that. And if you don't know these things, it becomes very difficult to predict what people might say, and that basically makes it impossible to understand if people also then speak with an accent or just don't speak in a way that you are used to. During my trip, I spent about a week, an hour's drive west of Beijing, and there were many locals who were also a bit older, and to be honest, I found it extremely difficult to understand what they said, even though it was possible with context. When I was able to guess what this interaction was about or what they might want to say, that of course makes it easier, but if you're just overhearing a conversation about something you don't know anything about, it is almost impossible to understand. The second insight I want to share relates to a situation where my listening ability was actually better than that of the native speakers I was with. And this is not because my understanding of Chinese is better or my listening ability, as most people perceive it, is better. It is simply because I was able to apply top-down listening in a way that they were not. And I will explain how this works in a bit. I think most of you would include things like how words are used in context in what you consider to be part of listening comprehension. Maybe you also include things like discursive knowledge, like I mentioned, for example, how you answer the phone, what you're supposed to say when you get in a restaurant, and things like that, and that's also part of listening comprehension. But I don't think most people consider world knowledge to be part of what listening comprehension is, yet it can be extremely important for listening comprehension. This could then be things like knowing about an important person in the community to which these people belong. It could be knowing about an important recent event, a landmark, or some cultural phenomenon, maybe a celebrity, maybe a band, or something else. And if you don't know these things and listen to a conversation that includes these, well, then of course you will find it very difficult to understand. And the better your language proficiency gets in general, the more you will be limited by not knowing these things. World knowledge can also relate to very practical things, however, and this is how I was able to understand something that my native-speaking companions did not. This happened in a large hospital, and I was there with two native speakers, and we received instructions for how to get where we were going. But the problem was that these instructions were not very clear unless you understood the layout of the building. None of us had been there before, but I got a pretty good idea of how things were connected on the way in, and so when we listened to the directions for how to walk, I realized that the person giving us instructions must have referred to a specific corridor, which would be a shortcut instead of going the long way round as we had done on our way in. This indeed turned out to be the case, so you can say that I successfully understood the instructions, not because my Chinese was superior to my companions, which clearly it isn't. Instead, maybe it's because I paid more attention on the way in, or my spatial awareness is better, or something else, but it's certainly not directly related to language learning. So anyway, this is another example of how applying knowledge about the world or something outside of the language is essential for understanding what someone says in the language. The third and the final example I want to share relates to random questions and comments. This is something I've encountered ever since I started learning Chinese, and I'm sure most listeners who have spent any time in a Chinese-speaking environment have encountered these strangers who just ask you a random question and you have no context and therefore you understand nothing. This is because without context you can't really apply top-down listening. Naturally, you can still see the person, you know where you are, you know what they look like and so on, but this is sometimes not enough because as a foreigner in China, you sometimes do receive very strange questions that you have no way of predicting. I have two examples from this trip, and in the first one, a young child asked me if there are any bingwu in Sweden. And this is not an extremely difficult word. If you see it in writing, it's pretty easy. Bing, ice, and wu, house. So bing wu then is not that hard to understand. But without any context coming out of the blue, this type of question can be very hard to understand. And even though I was able to parse what he said eventually, it took a little bit too long for this conversation to continue. The other example took place in the same room, actually, where this child's grandfather asked me a lot of questions about Swedish politics, which were based on some very strange assumptions and some wrong conceptions, and these were very difficult to understand because I simply had no idea what he might ask. So why am I sharing these things? Well, I think there are two reasons. First, I have been learning Chinese for well over 15 years and I've listened an awful lot, and I still run into these problems. Without context, things are very hard to understand sometimes. When people use dialects or when they speak in a manner that you're not used to, understanding will be difficult. This is not necessarily your fault, but of course you can always do more to try to understand more dialects, and the more time you spend doing this, the easier it will be to understand new dialects as well. Essentially, I'm trying to encourage you by saying that if I find these things difficult, then if you find them difficult and you've spent less time learning Chinese than I have, don't feel too bad about yourself. The second reason I wanted to share these insights is that context plays a crucial role here, and you need to practice this type of listening to get better at it. If you're learning Chinese in a foreign language environment, so for example in your home country where people don't speak Chinese, you will often encounter listening in situations where there is no context. For example, if your teacher just plays a random dialogue, there is no context. You don't see what people look like, you don't see what the building they're in looked like, you didn't walk into the building when you had this conversation, and so on. And so many of these things that I've been talking about are simply not things that you need to do if you're learning Chinese in a safe kind of classroom foreign language environment. Now, I'm not saying that that type of listening is useless, I'm just saying that there are a lot of things about listening comprehension which go well beyond the language itself. And if you want to be able to understand spoken Chinese in context, which is usually the goal for most people, you do need to practice these things as well. Now, you don't have to go to China to do these things. You can simulate, you can use role-playing activities with teachers, tutors, language exchange partners, and so on. But real-world communication with real people is essential for building this type of knowledge. If you found this discussion insightful, I suggest you check out my listening course, where I will try to teach you everything I know about listening comprehension and how to get better at it. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.